Hello there. Today I wanted to look at an Australian Shiraz, and this was a wine that caught my attention in a wine shop because the wine is Metala from Langhorne Creek. It's a Shiraz. It's the 2022 vintage on that. Now, I recall back in the 1990s selling a wine that was labelled as Saltram's Metala. Saltram, a winery in the Barossa Valley. The wine from them I remember is a Shiraz Cabernet that actually always used to represent really great value for money. It was a wine you could put down and age for a few years, but at that stage cost significantly less than £10 a bottle. It was a really interesting wine, and I think also a classic from the Langhorne Creek area. And Langhorne Creek is a region that a number of commentators suggest from South Australia is quite underappreciated. There are some excellent wines made here. There are some wines from Noon that make some fabulous drinking. There always used to be a wine made by Wolfblass's former chief winemaker John Gleitzer called John's Blend. It was an absolutely spectacular example of wine from Langhorne Creek. I think I've said it in the past, one of the pillars on which Wolfblass originally built their quality was the use of quite a lot of Langhorne Creek fruit in their wines. I also found out, as a result of research that I did for this video, that quite a large proportion of the wines for Jacob's Creek come from Langhorne Creek, and that is one of the things that ensures the quality of that brand, a brand whose quality surprised me fairly recently. This is a region that quite reliably makes good quality wines. So the story here for Metala starts back in 1839 when William Formby arrived in Australia. He was an Englishman and he spent the next 43 years working in South Australia before buying the Metala Estate next to the River Bremmer in this area of Langhorne Creek. Then 9 years later, in 1891, William and his son Arthur started planting vines here. They planted 21 rows of Shiraz and 14 rows of Cabernet. And evidently that Cabernet Sauvignon still exists, and so is actually, they claim, the oldest family-owned Cabernet Sauvignon anywhere in the world. And then in 1894 they planted a further 5.4 acres of Shiraz. And this all made Metala the second estate to be planted in the Langhorne Creek region, second only to the Potts family who planted their Bleasdales vineyards in 1860. Now, wines were made at a purpose-built winery at Metala right up until 1910, when for convenience Arthur allowed his brother-in-law, somebody called Ronald Martin, to make the wines at the Stonyfell winery, and this arrangement seemed to work. Now, I have a note that suggests that the first table wine in the Langhorne Creek area was made by Bleasdales in 1961. But if that is the case, they weren't the only people to start making table wine in that year, because the Metala Vineyard's most famous wine was its 1961 Shiraz Cabernet. It became famous because in 1962 it won the inaugural Jimmy Watson Trophy at the Adelaide Wine Show. The Jimmy Watson Trophy has tended to be the trophy that Australian winemakers see as the pinnacle of their achievement. It's for the best one-year-old red at the Adelaide show every year. So one of the points to take from this is perhaps prior to this period, the vineyards here were making fortified wines. But anyway, winning the Jimmy Watson Trophy ensured that Metala became a well-known brand. Continued being made at Stonyfell until the 1970s, when management shifted and a company called Dalgety Estates started making the Metala wines. And it was Dalgety Estates that owned Saltram in the Barossa Valley. So the wines from the Metala Vineyard became a brand that was being made by Saltram's. And for many years this went on while Saltram was under the ownership of Foster's. And at a later stage, when Foster's Brewing was purchased, the wine arm of Foster's was spun off and became Treasury Wine Estates. Now, Treasury included brands such as Penfolds and Wolfblass, and they continued producing the Saltram Metala wines. However, in 2017, they decided to break their contract with Arthur Formby's descendants, who still own the vineyard, but kept producing the Saltram Metala wines using fruit from other sources. Also, a potential confusion in terms of there being another wine made with the Metala designation is the fact that the Dolan Family Winery make some wines labelled as Metala because they buy fruit off some of the blocks of the vineyard. And the reason for this was the fact that somebody called Nigel Dolan was the chief winemaker at Saltram and had worked closely with the family prior to the breaking of relations by Treasury. At the Metala Vineyard in 1981, somebody called Guy Adams took over the running of the estate, and this was a 2,500 acre mixed estate, not just a winery. And at that stage, Guy was just 17, and he was a fifth generation descendant of Arthur Formby's. And clearly, Guy was proud and determined, and at the time he took over the business, the Australian government was offering money for a vine pool scheme to try and keep the country's vineyards in balance because there was significant overproduction. However, instead of taking money to pull up his vines, Guy decided that he was going to plant more, and he actually extended vineyard size here to somewhere in the region of 300 acres, which is about 120 hectares. And actually, subsequent to that, when they saw what was happening with the brand, Guy and his wife Liz had campaigned for about 20 years to try and get control back over the Metala brand for their family. Now, as well as owning the Metala Vineyard itself, the Adams family, a couple of other wine brands, one Brothers in Arms and the other Kilibinbin, both of which use grapes from the Metala Vineyard. Sometimes you do see the name being referenced with regard to those wines as well. So with changes going on at Treasury Wine Estates and with brands being sold off, finally in 2022, Guy and Liz Adams managed to regain control of the brand for Metala. So in fact here with the 2022, we have the first release of their wines under this label. And here I should say, it confused me when I saw it in the shop, because this label looks almost exactly like the Saltram Metala label that I remember from the 1990s. And the point is that the label evidently is an homage, pretty much a copy of the label of the wine that won the Jimmy Watson Trophy back in 1962. So it's a very traditional style. It's been slightly updated, but it's pretty much the same wording and it has the same crest on, except that it has Guy Adams' signature on the front of the bottle rather than that of Nigel Dolan from Saltram. So over the 130 years and 6 generations that the now Adams family have run the Metala Vineyard, they've continued to grow it, and they now have somewhere in the region of 225 hectares of vines in total. And they suggest that this sort of custodianship of the land and of the wonderful old vines they've got has given them a really quite sustainable approach. They suggest that they've always embraced a form of regenerative farming right across the estate. That's including broadacre and livestock farming. So just a bit more detail here. The Metala Vineyard is located, it's about 70 kilometres southeast of Adelaide, and typical of the earlier plantings from Langhorne Creek. It's on some ancient, deep, alluvial gravel soils on the banks of the Bremmer River. During the growing season, it benefits from the cooling influences of Lake Alexandrina, and this moderation of the climate helps to build structure in the wines, helps to give balance. They come across as being relatively cool climate, despite quite high sunshine hours here. The grapes for this wine were harvested from 4 distinct parcels within the Metala Vineyard in Langhorne Creek, and during fermentation, each parcel was kept separate in the winery. Maceration was allowed to go on for about 12 days, so not particularly extended maceration, and there was some quite gentle handling of the wine. We talk about minimal racking because of something called a gravity lift tank, and my assumption is that means that they're not pumping over, which means as you pump the must, some of the skins and the pips of the grapes will actually go through a pump and they'll be churned up there. So instead of you move the whole vat and say tip that into the press, that will avoid that additional churning, and it will help to give a much softer process of extraction. Now 50% of the wine was matured in tank. Therefore, I see you have 2 elements, an oaked element and a much fresher, fruitier, more sort of primary element that will be blended back into that. But the half of the wine that matured in oak spent 12 months there, with a little over 5% of the wine spending its time in 1-year-old French oak puncheons, so that's larger barrels, and then the remaining wine aging in 2, 3 and 4-year-old French and American hogsheads and barriques. So those are slightly smaller barrels, particularly the barriques. So let's see what we make of the wine, shall we? First thing I'd say is it's got a good dark colour. It's a sort of almost black ruby. There's a purple note at the rim, but it's a red purple, not a blue purple. It's relatively dark, but it's not actually that deep. Swirling it, the wine has, its label says 14.5%, but the analysis I've seen says it's actually 14.9%. And generally you're allowed to be within 0.5% of the analysis. So yes, a relatively alcoholic wine, and it is quite readily forming tears on the side of the glass there. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? Gosh, yeah, there is a really pungent aroma there of, it starts as a really sort of a minty, almost spearmint note, and then goes on to a much more sort of eucalypt sort of touch. It's really quite heady. Behind that there's a rich, spirity, dark, ripe fruit. So juicy dark cherries or something like that. So that's for taste. On the palate there is that, again, starts as a mintiness, becomes more of a eucalypt note. And studies have been done, and evidently this is due to a dust in the vineyard gathering on the vines that actually comes from broken up eucalyptus leaves. So it's a direct influence of the local environment on the flavour of the wine. It gives a sort of a fairly pungent bitterness to the back palate that's really quite mouth-watering. There's a richness and a ripeness, but then also in the mid palate there's a sort of an earthy note here, and that's very typical of Langhorne Creek, the sort of style of fruit that you get from there. The wine is medium to full-bodied, and there's a freshness coming through there that actually makes it feel lighter than the 14.9% alcohol that I've seen suggests. I mean, that's overlaying some sort of quite juicy, maybe slightly jammy red fruit, sort of very ripe red plum, ripe red cherry. Quite high tone, relatively bright, but then there is this sort of savoury, earthy note, perhaps just a hint of spice coming in over the top of that. And the oak has become quite nicely integrated. It doesn't stand out, but although primary fruit comes to the fore, I think it's sitting in there with that earthy note on the mid palate. And you get that sort of slightly bitter, mouth-watering grip on the finish. That's giving the wine some quite nice length, and there's a fresh finish. The tannins are very smooth. They're sort of like a very fine velvet, almost sort of a chocolatey smoothness. They're lovely and ripe, and that's really not where the grip is coming from. If anything, perhaps the wine could just do with a little more grip coming from its tannins. Now, the producers suggest that this is a wine that would age for 5 to 10 years. I think that's probably correct. I'm not sure why you would need it to be honest, because it is tasting beautiful now. A combination of freshness and the fine tannins should be sufficient to allow it to age in the medium term. I took a look at the Wine Searcher aggregated critics score for this wine, and it has 1 rating, and that came from the Decanter World Wine Awards. From that it has a score of 91 out of 100, which I think is quite a fair reflection of the quality I'm seeing here. I think this is a wine that very much reminds me of the wines that I enjoyed from Saltram back in the 1990s. And I think the Adams family are to be congratulated on reuniting the fruit source of the Metala Vineyard with their historic brand. I wish them every success with that. I think I'm interested in trying more Metala wine. So thank you very much for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, it would be great if you pressed the like button for me. If you'd like to watch more of these tastings, perhaps see if I do taste small wines from Metala, do please sign up, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and also do set yourself an alert and be notified every time I publish a new tasting. If you have any comments, please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to hear what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, it would be great if you'd pass it on to them. I would really appreciate that. So thank you once again for joining me, and I do hope you'll make some time in the near future and come and join me for another tasting. Till then, bye for now.